Hello to you all. My name is David Petrain. I am a professor at Hunter College and also at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm also the current president of the New York Classical Club. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's event, which is a lecture co-sponsored by the Classics program of the CUNY Graduate Center and the New York Classical Club. It's serving as the New York Classical Club's 2020 annual fall lecture, in fact. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to encourage anyone whose membership has lapsed at the New York Classical Club or who might be interested in joining to consider joining the club. The link to the club's website is www.thenewyorkclassicalclub.org. That might be visible to you in the chat, but I'm not sure. It's pretty easy to find. We'd be delighted to have you as a member. And without further ado, let me move on to introducing our speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce someone whom I've known for many years. Jackie Murray is Associate Professor of Classics and of African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. She completed her PhD in Classics at the University of Washington. Professor Murray is an expert in Hellenistic Greek literature. That is to say, the ancient Greek literature that was written in the period from the death of Alexander the Great down to about 31 BCE and the rise of the Roman Empire. I first met Professor Murray at a conference in the Netherlands devoted to Hellenistic poetry. It was part of an annual series designed to give young scholars of this poetry a venue in which to share their ideas. In the past, you see, Hellenistic poetry tended to be neglected or dismissed as overly bookish and inaccessible, so that those of us who were passionate about it really had to band together and do what we could to promote it as worthy of study. Lately, the stock of Hellenistic poetry has been steadily rising, thanks in no small part to the work of scholars like Jackie. Her many articles have uncovered the ways in which Hellenistic poets talked to each other, introduced themes of gender into their works, and even engaged with contemporary developments in astronomy, which we'll hear about tonight. She has written chapters for companions to Hellenistic literature that make this fascinating material more available to the lay reader. Another focus of Professor Murray's research and teaching is the theme of race and the classics, and also the reception of classics in African American and Afro-Caribbean literature. She recently co-organized, in fact, a conference at Penn State on the subject of W.E.B. Du Bois and the ancient Mediterranean. And she has a recent article on Du Bois's first novel entitled The Quest of the Silver Fleece. And that gives us an interesting segue into the topic of tonight's discussion, in which Jackie will be discussing the Argonautica by the Hellenistic poet Apollonius of Rhodes. The title of her talk is Anchored in Time, the Date in Apollonius's Argonautica. And I turn it over to her now.
Hi, David. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity and also for the wonderful introduction. And I encourage everyone to join the New York Classics Club. I should also make a point of correction for the conference that we co-organized with Matthias Hanses on Du Bois and the ancient Mediterranean. Because of the pandemic, we had to postpone it. So it's actually going to take place this spring. So stay tuned for alerts as to that. All right, so I'm going to try to share my screen. See if this works according to my plan. Let's see here. Okay, I told everyone can see my screen. So as David pointed out, the talk is Anchored in Time, the Date in Apollonius Argonautica. And it's actually, I've already published most of the arguments. So what I'm going to do is go over the main points and add a little bit to it. So I'll begin with a brief history of the controversy over Apollonius's chronology, which is what sort of occasioned this discussion. And then I'm going to talk about using astronomy in the Argonautica to settle the controversy. And then I'll close with some fun samples of what I call astropoetics in the Argonautica. Okay. So, a brief history. Now, these are the main biographical sources for Apollonius's chronology. And starting with the earliest, you have poems by Callimachus, Theocritus, and other poets who are contemporaries with Apollonius. And many of these poets had mentioned actual historical figures, specific Ptolemies, etc. And so we can locate them. The Argonautica, however, doesn't mention any particular Ptolemy explicitly, so that makes it hard to figure out where it fits. And it also has really strong intertextual relationships with the poets that are his contemporaries, Callimachus and Theocritus poems, especially the poems that engage with Argonautic themes, have strong intertextual connections. So the poems are the earliest. Then we have statements by Quintilian in his Institutio Oratoria. We have two vitae of Apollonius that come with the Scholia, and then we have several references in the Suda, the Byzantine Encyclopedia, where referring to all the other Apollonius and other his contemporaries. And then there is the recently in relation to the other things that go all the way back to the first century BCE, the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 1241, a second century CE papyrus, which was published in 1914, and it's a so-called list of Alexandrian librarians. Now, what's important is that all of the other sources before the publication of this Oxyrhynchus Papyrus actually are consistent with each other. You'll read a lot of discussion about how the biographical sources about Apollonius are conflicting, etc. They're only conflicting when we take this Oxyrhynchus Papyrus seriously. When we don't, all the other sources actually cohere. So quickly, we find out in the Vita that Apollonius came to prominence under the Ptolemies. He's referred to as a student of Callimachus, which basically means he was a junior contemporary to Callimachus. And in Vita A, there's also one of the manuscripts actually identifies which Ptolemy he was associated with, which was Ptolemy, so-called Euergetes, Ptolemy III. And then in the Suda references, we have, for Apollonius, we find that he is placed as contemporary of Eratosthenes, Euphorion, another poet who actually ended up being the librarian for the Seleucid library, Timarchus, the tyrant of Miletus, and then he's also said here in the Suda specifically identified with Euergetes again, and he then is also said to be the successor of Eratosthenes as the head of the Alexandrian library. Okay. Then in a sort of problematic Suda entry for Aristophanes of Byzantium, which seems to be split over his own entry and an entry for a comic poet called Astronomus, they point out that, okay, Aristophanes of Byzantium was a student of Callimachus and of Xenodotus. Xenodotus was an old man when he was his teacher as a boy, and Callimachus was a young man when he was his teacher as a young man. So one of the things we can take away from this is that Callimachus and Xenodotus lifespans overlapped, and they also overlapped with Aristophanes of Byzantium. And if Aristophanes is a junior of Callimachus, then he's contemporary of Apollonius. And then this other piece that we get from the other person's entry, we get Ptolemy. He lived during Ptolemy Philadelphus's reign, and he seemed to come to prominence under Philopator, Ptolemy IV, and he managed the library of the king after Apollonius. So now we have Eratosthenes, Apollonius, Aristophanes. And then we know also that Aristophanes is succeeded by his own student Aristarchus later. We can place Aristophanes also in relation to Eumenes II in his reign, because apparently Eumenes tried to headhunt him for his library, and so that puts him in relation to Ptolemy V as well. So, all right. And then Quintilian, who says that Apollonius's Argonautica wasn't included in the canon of epic poets because the guys who made up the canon of epic poets, Aristophanes and Aristarchus, um, didn't want to include contemporaries in their number, in the canon. So, given that Quintilian's canon seemed to be based on Aristophanes and Aristarchus, um, the fact that he says that everyone universally plays Callimachus and Philetus in the canon of elegiac poets, the implication is that they at some point when Callimachus died, he was put in the canon, and Apollonius is still running around. So Aristophanes and Aristarchus felt a bit of hesitation to include the Argonautica in that list. All right. So what we end up with from the Suda then, and the other sources, not just the Suda, but the other sources, is this picture of Apollonius, Eratosthenes, and Euphorion being immediate identical contemporaries. Possibly Aristophanes might be as well, but we can't figure out when he was born. However, his life does cover the same ground. And in terms of order, according to these sources, Eratosthenes is the librarian under Euergetes. Apollonius would come in at some point at the end of Euergetes, beginning of Philopater's reign, and Aristophanes comes in at the end of Philopater, beginning of Epiphanes' reign. And this is all the sources except for this papyrus agree to this, or they don't contradict it, in other words. Now, the papyrus then is interesting. It appeared published by Grenfell and Hunt in 1914. And they claimed that it was a characteristic product of Alexandrian erudition. So it's some sort of descendant of Hellenistic scholarship, and that it was grammarians' notes and whatnot. However, the look of it, I've suggested is that it looks like more of like a literary document. In fact, it's the hand is identified by Turner as a hand that scribed for literary documents, so not really documentary. However, it's been treated as if it's like the official list of Alexandrian librarians, and this is because one column in the 6 that we have has mentions people, including Apollonius, Eratosthenes, Aristarchus, and Aristophanes, who we know to be connected to the Alexandrian library. Now, the document, as far as we have it, there are lacunas, so I'll grant that. However, there's no reference to the library at all in this, what we have of the document. What we do have are references to these people as didaskaloi, teachers, tutors of the king's children. And so that's already, to me, the jump from saying that these guys are librarians comes from the fact that we know that these guys are librarians. And so the text doesn't say that they are, but because we know they are, we're then claiming that they're librarians. Anyway, another thing is that this text is chronologically bizarre. It starts off by claiming that Apollonius was the teacher of the first king, which would make him a contemporary of Aristotle or something like that, which is completely false. It says that Eratosthenes succeeded him. It says that Aristophanes of Byzantium succeeded Eratosthenes. It then puts in another Apollonius, the Idographer, who may be the same Apollonius. It puts him after Aristophanes, and then has Aristarchus after him. We have no other evidence to suggest that this is even correct. Now, the editors fix things. They amend first king to where it's clear that it says protos. Nevertheless, they edit it, amend it to say the third king, which means that they agree with the Suda, which says that it's Euergetes. They amend the other indications of dating for Aristarchus that were incorrect, putting him with Philomator instead of Philopator, which is what the document says. And they continue to amend things. The only chronological statement they don't amend is this statement that Eratosthenes succeeded Apollonius. Seems kind of, to me, I thought this was kind of arbitrary. If you're going to amend all, you might as well amend all. All right. And so what we end up then with is, on the one hand, we have all the sources that generally agree with the Suda, putting the order that I mentioned, Eratosthenes, Apollonius, Aristophanes, Aristarchus, with the Oxyrhynchus, putting everybody a lot earlier, putting them all under the wrong king, and in this order of Apollonius, Eratosthenes, Aristophanes, Apollonius, and then Aristarchus. All right, so this was the state of affairs before I intervened. And also, this then meant, of course, moving the publication of the Argonautica earlier under Ptolemy II. And so most books on Apollonius will agree with Richard Hunter's earlier suggestion that the Argonautica was published under Ptolemy II, probably in the 270s. There's a minority of scholars who would say that, no, it probably is later, putting it under early Euergetes there, but the majority of scholars tended to agree with that. And this, of course, is not what the Suda says. Okay, so now my intervention with the astronomy. So Quintilian says that we should pay attention. He's in advising the orator, young orator. You should pay attention to astronomy in poetry because the poets use it to indicate time. So I decided to take his advice and follow along. All right. So what's interesting about the Argonautica is, in the first two books, Apollonius is very rigorous in telling us how much time is passing once they leave the island of Lemnos till they arrive in Colchis. And this is documented already by Villon, the French editor of the text. And in this case, it's very much like the way Xenophon in the Anabasis is telling his reader how much time and how much terrain is covered in the march. And so as with the Anabasis, it's possible to sort of figure out what time they're traveling and how long it takes, etc. So too with the Argonautica. Now, what's interesting with Apollonius is that he also intersperses astronomical events that are happening in the sky above the Argonauts as they are going. So, and I'm going to go through the ones that are mentioned that are crucial. So at the end of book one, where we have the abduction of Hylas, who's one of the Argonauts, sort of a friend of Hercules, the Hylas gets abducted in the myth, where he goes to the get some water for the rest of the Argonauts, and as he's at this pool fountain, he is sighted by these nymphs and then abducted because of his beauty. And what's interesting is that Apollonius says that his beauty was enhanced by the full moon, and then this incited the nymph to grab him. Okay, so we have a full moon mentioned. Now then, in the same episode, we're also told, which causes the Argonauts to leave them behind, is that Tiphys, the pilot, sees the morning star in the morning and tells everybody to get on board the ship and start going before the winds start to change against them. And when the sun comes up, they realize, oh, we've left Hercules behind, and the other two, Hylas and Polyphemus as well. And then they get into a fight as to whether or not they should go back or not. However, so we've got now the morning stars. We have full moon, now the morning star on the next day. So all right. And then we're told later, as they're about to arrive at Colchis, that Zeus indicated storms or the rainy season or the autumn by the rising of Arcturus. So the constellation of the herder, with the main star being Arcturus. So we know when that happens. And then in book 4, as Medea is running away to join the Argonauts, she's mocked by the moon, the new moon, when she sees her. And so we now have a new moon. Now, what's interesting about the way these astronomical events are distributed along the voyage, and according to Apollonius's calendar, we could say, oops, didn't want to go there yet, is that they're realistic. So in terms of how much time has passed, the constellations, the moons, etc., would fall as they would. Now, this Arcturus is important because it's one of the stars that we need to identify, because it rises at a certain point time of year. And what's interesting is that it's usually, how you're going to figure out what time of year it is has to do with the latitude that you're at. And so, yeah, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, the latitude that we're at. Sorry about the we tested this, but it didn't work. Okay, so the latitude. So what normally when we hear about the bear in the bear constellation in Greek poetry and Roman poetry, for that matter, we're told that the bear never sets. The bear it never gets wet, never touches the water. And that's because of the latitude of Greece and Rome it makes the constellation what we call circumpolar. So, all right. Now, Apollonius, though, has this bizarre statement in the Argonautica in Book 3, where he refers to the stars of the bear, Helike, as setting, which is very odd. And for a long time, I thought that, this is just aberrant astronomy Apollonius is engaged in. However, actually, it matters where you are. So if you are in the north, yeah, it never sets. However, if you move south and you get to Alexandria, some of the stars of the bears do set. And so that gives us our point of view for observation, and allows us to figure out what time of year or what date precisely that the star Arcturus rises. And that's September 23rd. And so given that we know how many days have passed, we can then calculate out back what the other dates are for the other astronomical events. And so what we end up with is, okay, we had that full moon would have been on July 15th, Venus as morning star on the 16th, September 23rd for the Arcturus rising, and then the crescent moon on the first crescent moon on the 29th of September. Okay. So now apart from Venus, the other references, the moon and the Arcturus constellation, they all are seasonal and would happen every year. So there's no way of really telling what year that is. And this is why nobody's really tried to use it. However, Venus does help, because in combination with all of these other astronomical events, we can narrow it down, because Venus doesn't always appear to be morning star in July, right? And in fact, in July, Venus can be in 4 different positions. It can be in Virgo, Leo, Cancer, or Gemini. Now, why I'm referring to that is that, well, in July, the sun is in the constellation Cancer. And so if Venus is in the same constellation as the sun, you can't see it because the sun is blocking it. If Venus is in Leo or Virgo, it's below the horizon when the sun comes up, so it's not the morning star. And so the only constellation that rises before Cancer in July is Gemini. And so for Venus to be the morning star in July, it needs to be in Gemini. Now, what's really cool about this is that Apollonius tells us in the same period, the next episode, in the boxing match, that he compares Polydeuces, one of the Gemini, to Venus. However, Venus, the evening star. nonetheless, so the idea then is of Venus being in Gemini is reinforced by the simile. Now, so now we have this information, we can narrow things down. So in the first column, I have all the years beginning with the reign of Ptolemy, beginning of Ptolemy II's reign, and the end of Ptolemy III's reign, where Venus is in Gemini in July. And then in the next column, I have the phase of the moon that the moon is on 15th of July, and the day of the full moon in that year in July, and then the moon phase on the 29th of September. And so it turns out that only one year works, which is the year 238 BCE, where we have a full moon on the 15th of July, and we have a crescent moon on the 29th, and Venus is in Gemini. So that's kind of striking, especially when it turns out that the year 238 it is significant because the king, Ptolemy Euergetes, and his wife Berenike are implemented a new calendar in that year, which was based on the star Sirius, which happens to also be rising on the 15th of July. So there can't be coincidence that Apollonius is mapping on the poem to this particular year. And in fact, in promulgating this calendar, the king is said to say, the new calendar shall be implemented in order that all may know that the former lapse in the relationship of the seasons of the year and the opinions about the whole orderly arrangement of the heavens have been corrected and improved by the Theo Euergetae. In other words, the king and the queen are claiming to have fixed the heavens with their reign. And so the Argonautica fits into this new calendar by itself, becoming a kind of mythological calendar for his readers. All right, so to get back to this controversy then, so now what we have is, okay, we've got the papyrus, which puts everything early, and we have all of the other sources plus the astronomical dating in the poem that all say that Apollonius was under Ptolemy III, wrote the Argonautica in that period. Now, this affects, of course, the way in which we read those allusions that we saw, that I mentioned, that were connecting Apollonius to his contemporaries. So now I want to just close off with some fun with the astronomy in the poetry. So, okay, so the Greeks long used astronomy in their poetry. Already in the Odyssey, we have Odysseus sailing by the stars. He's given instructions by Calypso how to get back home, what stars to follow. And so here she tells him to keep these certain stars on his right as he's going forward. Now, what's interesting is that, so it tells us what direction he's going. He's going east, but it also tells us what time of year. In order to have all these stars sort of setting, with Bootes setting last, then it would probably be in around March. So we have a sense of like what time of year Odysseus is going. And then we have in the Parthenon of Alcman, another archaic poem, we have references to the Pleiades and Sirius, and there's a lot of controversy about what's going on in this passage. However, I would suggest that what's going on is the girls are fighting with the Pleiades to get this cloak wherever they're getting it to, and the cloak is like the star. Is that it has a lot to do with the sequence of astronomical figures. So the Pleiades do rise before Sirius does. So perhaps it's the time period it takes the girls to get where they're going to the temple with the cloak. Might be a way of looking at this. All right. Pindar too also uses the stars for indicating, in this case, I would say inevitability here. So he has the this victor Timoneos, who has won games at the Nemean games, and he says he can now expect to win at the Isthmian and the Pythian games, just like the rising of Orion is not far from the Pleiades of the mountain. And we just saw that the Pleiades rise first, then close after that is the Orion, and then of course Sirius. So the sequence of stars are going to happen no matter what, and so to this victor will win at the games, and so that's all fine. Now, in the Hellenistic period, we get the scientific things get a bit more scientific in the study of astronomy, and spheres start to become a thing. Already Aratus in his Phenomena is poeticizing a treatise by Eudoxus about the heavens, and he talks about it as if he's talking about some kind of sphere. And so these are two Hellenistic spheres that may or may not have been available to Apollonius and his contemporaries, but they seem to, the poetry does show that they seem to be thinking about spheres as well. So, for example, Theocritus, in his poem dedicated to Ptolemy II, where he is referring to the baby Hercules strangling the serpents, and he points out that at the time when Hera sent the snakes into the crib with Iphicles and Hercules, it was a time when the bear turns down to the west and Orion is revealing his shoulder. So that was a particular time of year, which works out to be about February in the 3rd century, and which also maps on to the Ptolemaic dynastic birthday. All right. Now, what's interesting is that if you turn the sphere to the opposite end, right, to look on the eastern to see what's rising on the horizon, you find out that the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent strangler, is actually what's rising. So you have the Orion setting and the serpent strangler rising in a poem that is about baby Hercules strangling the serpents. It's very clever for Theocritus. And Apollonius also seems to expect us to know about or think about astronomy in more scientific terms. So, for example, the first simile in the Argonautica is a simile comparing the Argonauts to stars. They are like stars that stand out prominently among the clouds. Now, often people go back to the Homeric similes where there's stars and clouds, but the clouds here, I would argue, are the nebula that make up the Milky Way, where we do find the Argo constellation and not too far off the Gemini constellation, et cetera. So he's getting us to think, he's sort of what I call naturalized the Homeric astronomical simile, made it an Argonautic simile by making it more about stars and astronomically. All right, now to get back to this sphere thing. So just I put over there the Theocritus sphere situation with Ophiuchus on one end of the sphere and Orion on the other. Now, in the same episode where Hylas gets abducted and Hercules is left behind, Hercules, the reason they stop is because Hercules has broken his oar and they just run aground onto Chios. And then Hercules goes off to look for an appropriate tree to make a new oar. And as he's pulling out this tree that he found, the narrator compares him to a wind that knocks over a mast when wintry at the wintry setting of Orion. So we have a astronomical simile where the Orion is setting. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, this is an allusion to the Theocritean simile, where Hercules, at the beginning of his career, is you have Orion, Ophiuchus is rising, right? And here now we have, this is the end of his career because he's going to do one of his last labors, which is the Apples of the Hesperides in the time period of the Argonautica. The Ophiuchus is setting because Orion is rising, okay? But that place is a little bit more clever than that. So Theocritus tells us in his Hylas poem, so he has a poem that's about the abduction of Hylas as well, and he says that the Argonauts set sail when the Pleiades were rising. And this is not even even remarkable to say that people set sail when the Pleiades are rising. Okay, Apollonius doesn't go there. Oddly, what he says is that at dawn and when the light of the sun was gleaming, etc., all the gods came down and watched the Argo launch come out of port, and the nymphs, etc., coming down the mountain. And he says that and Chiron came down with baby Achilles and wet his feet in the water. Now, of course, Chiron is the constellation Sagittarius, right? And so where we have Pleiades rising according to Theocritus, well, on the other side of the sphere is Sagittarius is setting. So we have Apollonius alluding to Theocritus's clever Herculean astronomical sphere illusion, and doing it exactly with his in this very odd way of referring to the Pleiades rising by referring to the Chiron stepping in the water. And there's other kind of clever things that Apollonius is doing with the astronomy that needs to be uncovered. Let's just say. So I'm just going to end here, and I'll take questions. I don't know.
Hi, Jackie. I was just blown away by that, and I'm going to ask the first question. It's a double question. How did you? Well, let me rephrase. I was blown away by that, so blown away that I neglected to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, which is not very many of you, I'm Jennifer Roberts. I'm the acting executive officer of the classics department at the Graduate Center, where if you have interest in doing work towards a master's degree or a doctorate, we are always glad to hear from you. And we have partnered with the New York Classical Club, of which I was president many years ago, and of which I'm very fond, to bring you this event. And I'm very glad to see so many people registered, both from our department and from the New York Classical Club. And there is some overlap there, I'm happy to say. And if you're a member of our department and don't belong to the New York Classical Club, I hope you will change that, because it's just a wonderful organization. And it's brought many wonderful speakers over the years, and certainly one of the most wonderful today. Jackie, I took astronomy in college for 2 days until it became clear that the textbook was written at a level sort of for second graders, and I didn't understand a word. So that was the end of me and astronomy. I'm impressed here, and I wondered if you could begin by telling us how you got interested in this and how you trained yourself in astronomy. Was this something that was part of your youth?
Yeah, well, I really liked astronomy as a kid, and then when I did basically several courses of astronomy at my undergrad at Guelph, University of Guelph, and I was really interested in the history of astronomy in particular. And when in my Greek class, when we read the Argonautica, I asked the professor, has anyone tried to use the astronomy to date the poem, given that it's such a controversial issue? And he's like, oh no. So I thought, well, it must be possible. And this was going to be my dissertation topic, actually, when I went to University of Washington. However, Jim Claus was, nope, good dissertations, done dissertation. So it takes a long time to get it done. But yeah, I've always been interested, and that's presumably why I was attracted to the poem itself, is that because it's got a lot of astronomical references, etc. Yeah, but now I get to combine both Greek and astronomy.
It's a wonderful intersection. My retired colleague Sarah Pomeroy has gone to various places and looked through telescopes on mountains, and was able to, when we wrote our Greek history text together, was able to incorporate some of that knowledge, which I certainly don't have. Well, it's a wonderful combination, and it's really enabled you to do marvelous things that people who don't have both kinds of skills are not going to be able to do. This is fascinating. We have a question from Darcy Krasny, who thanks you, as we do all, and says that she's curious whether there are other Hellenistic instances of Ophiuchos being connected. She only recalls some late instances. And she also thanks you for the Chiron reference. So what about other Hellenistic instances of Ophiuchos being connected with Heracles?
I haven't actually gone too much to explore yet on that, but I do think that it's one of the constellations that they are associating with Hercules at the time, right? And so I think like it's one of the, I think Apollonius is interested in it because he's interested in controversial. He's just interested in anything controversial. I think Theocritus is interested in it because he's actually part of the trying to establish it as a constellation for Hercules. I think that that's what his job is, what he's trying to do, what his effort is. Whereas I think with Apollonius, it's a controversial constellation, and he is into controversy. So like that's what I'm working on right now, is this controversy poetics, where Apollonius tries to engage in whatever controversy happens to be, scholarly controversy happens to be going on. And so I think that, but I mean, I would have to do some more looking, because I do have another project looking at the astronomical poetry to see where does Ophiuchus actually show up. So I'll report back once I've found out a bit more about it. But I think there's something going on there.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm interested in particular in Eratosthenes. I've always been very, very interested in Eratosthenes and the way in which he demonstrated the circumference of the Earth more accurately than the calculation that Columbus was using when he set sail in 1492.
Right.
And I'm always taken aback by people who try to tell me that the Greeks all thought the world was flat. And surrounded by streams of ocean, which some did and others didn't.
Right.
And I see we have some more questions coming, and I'm going to pull these up here. Well, I think the question that I see now is a question that's very apropos, but I know you've seen it before. It was a question that David Petrain asked when we were doing our practice session, which is, why is this so much fun? And I think that's a very apt question. We weren't supposed to still have it on the screen, but he certainly rightly foresaw that your talk was going to be a great deal of fun. So I'm trying to, it says very clearly that there are other questions in the Q&A, but I don't seem to see them. And if those of you who have posed questions are wondering where they went, that makes two of us. And I encourage you to repose them or for others to pose questions of Jackie.
Well, I can see some questions. I don't know if you see them, but
how interesting. Why would I see them?
Yeah, I see David's other question. So is there any indication that the Apollonius's readers picked up the fact that he was using the night sky to point to a specific date? I'm not 100% sure, but it would appear to be that, because that year was so significant for astronomical things. In the case of, like, they're making a calendar, and then the king, part of the calendar was to focus on the rising of Sirius and sort of lock it in to a specific Ptolemaic month, or sorry, Egyptian month, Piney, where normally it would have wandered throughout the year, right? But he wanted to lock it in the calendar. So I think they were aware of that, and they seem to be fascinated with the idea of Venus in Gemini as well as a thing to worry about. There's an astral omen where it refers to when Sirius is rising, the Egyptian astral omen, when Sirius is rising and Venus is in Gemini, the king will be good to Egypt, which is Euergetes' name. So it suggests that we're making the omen to map onto the king, to map onto the astronomical phenomena. So perhaps, but there's still got to look at poets who are looking after Apollonius to see if they see it, but it would appear that I would think they must if it's such a big deal, but that's going to require some work. And then there's a
No,
question from Gina Claude. You see that
yes,
one?
I see that. Yes, I do.
Okay.
She is like me. She uses the expression blown away, and I can understand that. And she says she's wondering how much opposition to this theory have you encountered to date, and from what sort of scholars? She says that she's aware that there are still people who insist on the alternate chronology of the Oxyrhynchus papyrus that you discussed, but
Mhm.
she's not sure how they can defend it in the light of the case that you present, and perhaps they can't defend it.
Right. Well,
What would you like to comment?
well, definitely the Oxyrhynchus argument that I published has received a lot of pushback, including an Italian scholar who wrote an article attempting to refute my article with twice as long as my article. So, but that was before I had the astronomical argument made up. Now I think quite a few people are willing to accept that the Argonautica is where I put it. The issue is whether or not those people are communicating to the folks who are still defending the papyrus, because the papyrus is really problematic in not just in its position, putting the various librarians in weird orders in relation to the kings, but it's also a document that seems to be it's a literary document. It's supposed to be, I think it's a joke that it's something from the 2nd century CE. That's a period where people are making scholarly spoofs, and I think it falls into that group where the speaker or the voice of the text is some overwrought grammarian type who contradicts himself as he goes through, and he's making these arguments about things that are not even argued about. So I think, yeah, the folks who are insisting on the papyrus can't. I mean, I don't know what they can defend it with, because it's only the papyrus that says its thing. Everything else is in agreement with the astronomy and Suda and the Vita and all the Vita for all the other characters. So I find it very difficult to see how they could support it. There's
your case is extremely convincing, and one person who was convinced is my colleague Phil Thibodeau, who comments, "Great talk, very convincing," and he asks, wasn't there a revolt against the calendar reform sometime later? He says he thinks the farmers of Egypt were conservative and did not like the change.
Well, I'm not sure if that is not just that view is not just like speculation, because I'm sure the calendar doesn't continue on after early into Ptolemy IV's reign. Like, it doesn't seem to be operating outside of Alexandria in general, and then it doesn't seem to be operating in the southern part of Egypt after Ptolemy IV's reign. So it's in that respect, I think it was unsuccessful in terms of how it relates to Egypt. But I wonder if it's unsuccessful more in the sense of what it was. I think what its attempt to accomplish was actually a universal Greek calendar. That's the argument that I make, that it's actually aimed at Greeks, given that it was actually functioning in Alexandria quite well into the reign of Ptolemy IV. And then what this provides for Greeks then is a calendar that unifies all of the other calendars, because remember, Greek calendars are all over the map. And so I think that it's unsuccessful in that after Ptolemy IV, the Seleucid influence in the Ptolemaic court upsets things, and maybe that doesn't get continued. But I'm not sure I'm not so sure it was supposed to be adopted by the larger country Egypt in general. And then I think that my idea is, I think it's actually for the Greek. It's Greek oriented in its perspective. That's what I think.
Thank you very much. We have a question from my student Kiran Mansukani. who says thank you for this talk. And he says he enjoyed the talk as well as the gorgeous slides and wants to know what program did you use to make the moving constellations? And I want to know that too.
Yeah, so there's a great, easily free available program called Stellarium. So if you just type in Stellarium, it'll take you to a website, and then you can just download it. They're using NASA's data and everything, and you can use that. It's very good for like beautiful images. It's good. The other program that I used is Voyager. Voyager 4.5, but that's discontinued in relation to the latest Apple software. So you have to be using earlier Apple software in order to get it to run on your computer. It probably would work on a PC, however. And then the other one would be Starry Night is another one that I've used. Yeah, so I would recommend any one of those.
That's great. We have a question from my colleague Joel Lidov, who, like me, says he is always amazed that anyone can master these details. That's what I thought the day I dropped astronomy. I have some sense, he says, that there are modern tables and textbooks that you could have used, but how did Apollonius know all this? Did he have mechanical aids like the globe? And I think we are all wondering.
Yeah, I definitely think the sphere is they were using the sphere. That's why I don't think he can make this allusion to Theocritus without the sphere. But I also think that he's working with so it's after the fact, right? And so he's working with records, astronomical records about where these ephemerides type of things, where they're marking down daily what are the astronomical phenomena. So he would be using records as they would for astrology. So I think it's a post factum in putting in the astronomy in the poem after the event. And that opens up a whole other question of like, okay, so if 238 is in the poem as the year being commemorated, then the poem has to be even later, right? Because they need to be able to put that in, right? So I think that he doesn't need to calculate anything. He just needs to actually know what the astronomical events were on specific days as he's going forward, right? And then, or he can also consult astronomers. I mean, he is in the Library of Alexandria, so he could definitely consult those. Yeah. So I think he's working with records. That would what I would say.
Yeah. My colleague Phil Thibodeau has a suggestion, he says maybe going for a pan-Hellenic calendar.
Yeah, this is my hypothesis is that the point of the Canopus Decree calendar is not oriented toward Egyptians, because it's actually quite problematic from an Egyptian point of view in that it's stopping the wandering of the calendar. Like they're, by introducing a leap year, you're keeping the star Sirius rising on a specific day, and it's explicit that that's what he wants to happen in the calendar. Like the star wants, and it's his birthday, and then going to add in the leap year is going to be for him and his wife. The calendar is clearly to celebrate the king and his wife. Now, I could see how, yeah, if there was a revolt to the calendar, it would be on religious grounds from Egyptians not being okay with that. But it actually has a practical function for Greeks, where they could have a calendar that is astronomically based, that you could then get the grain in on time or whatever, right? Because everyone else, all the other Greek states have different calendars, and so as a result, they had to have ultimately come up with an Antikythera device to sort of synchronize all the calendars, right? Whereas this would have been a calendar that could work. And the fact that the calendar is based on the star Sirius, which is very close in periodicity to the sun, so it's it's just a couple of point off in terms of its same cycle. So it looks like a solar calendar when it's actually really a Sirius calendar, but so it would work where the seasons would map on according to their astronomical relationships. So I think that's the I think that's what's going on, especially when you compare like the lunar calendar or a lunar solar calendar and all the calculations that need to happen for that. So yeah, so I would say, yeah, I think he's going for a panel and a calendar. I think it, and it then gets it's the basis of Caesar's calendar later, right? Only that Caesar moves it to the sun instead of the star. So yeah.
Yeah. Ian's story at Trent University, where he reports it is very cold up in central Ontario, asks, "What does rising mean? Is he right that rising means a helical
Yeah,
rising, the
yeah,
earliest
meaning like
state
the
on
first
which
time,
star?"
yeah, that's what I mean by that in terms of the first time it appears after a period of invisibility, the first time it
Okay,
appears. Yeah.
okay, so that was the first time it can be seen just before dawn, and then setting means when a constellation or star sets at sunset.
And then never seen again till it comes back around, right? Yeah. So it's last, the setting is usually the last setting. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And my colleague Peter Simpson has observed that some years ago at the Graduate Center, a talk was given on the events of the Odyssey, which use astronomical phenomena, often alluded to, of course, in the poem by their associated mythological epithets, including an eclipse of the sun, to do so. And these data were used to fix the time of the events, not the time of the poem's composition. So Peter asks, why are these astronomical data in the poem relevant to the date of composition rather than to the supposed date of the mythical story? Or alternatively, didn't Apollonius care to be realistic about the astronomy in the poem, but did about the astronomy's own time and place?
Yeah, well, I think it is related. At this time, of course, Eratosthenes and others are trying to fix the Trojan War and date this as well, right? So finding a date, a mythological date, or dates for the mythological events matter as well. So what I'm suggesting that he's saying is that just as at the time the Argonauts were sailing, the stars were in this position, it has finally come all the way back around that now the stars are back in the same position. So this idea of the long cycle of the stars coming back to an originary position in the heavens, and then this is the sort of signaling or heralding of a golden age, right? That now that the stars have so because the Argonauts are the first heroes, right? They're the heroes that are directly the first heroes, right? They're the ones who are the children of the gods and heroines, right? The generation before the Trojan War. That point is very concerned about making sure that they're the first, right? And so they're the first heroes, and yeah. So the idea is that, well, we're now in a similar period of so that the stars. I think that's what he's trying to do, where the mythological events go back to that period. So there's a mirroring or cycling coming back. So I think that's what, his contemporaries were preoccupied with. When did the Trojan War happen? When did the mythological events happen? So he's somehow engaged with that. I definitely think he's engaged with that. But he's suggesting an astronomical argument that's sort of circular, literally circular.
Well, Peter reports that he's very pleased with your reply. As we saw, that was very, very detailed. And I have a question, which is also a question, again, by Kira Mansukani, whether you have a recommendation for a layperson who wants to understand the astronomy of the period. He's always been interested in this, but he felt daunted by the science.
Well, there's a book by John Evans, is it James Evans, on ancient astronomy. You could start there, and then there's also I guess yeah, it's hard to get around the science part. I'm just trying to think.
Yeah.
Even Evans has the science part in it. But his book is actually set up to teach you the ancient astronomy. So you might want to start there, because he even has exercises for you to do in that one. But he also explains how ancient astronomy worked. So that would be one I would suggest. And then there's books by Hannah, Robert Hannah has a couple of books on ancient timekeeping and calendars, etc. Yeah, but that's where I would start.
Thank you. Apparently that was Patricia Hatcher's question, and it appeared on my screen as Kieran's question. And Kieran wants us all to know that that was Patty. So you've answered Kieran and Patty. I think we have time for one more question. Phil Thibodeau, again, has gotten to the question that you mentioned earlier, of the question of the enormous interest in the date of the fall of Troy. And he was wondering about Hellenistic attempts to pin down the date of the Argonautica along the lines of the attempt to pin down the fall of Troy.
Well, yeah, this would seem to be what Apollonius is sort of engaging with, right? Because he has explicitly that Achilles is a baby when, or at least a young toddler, when the Argonauts set sail, right? However, Apollonius also has no Troy in the Argonautica. So he seems to be, and he fools around with chronology in general. Like he has Theseus earlier than Jason and Medea, when of course they're usually after. So but this to me suggests that he is engaged in fooling around with those questions. Like the others are seriously engaged, like Eratosthenes is seriously engaged in trying to figure out when the fall of Troy was, by using genealogies and things like that, right? Where Apollonius is sort of, I would say, making a mockery of that kind of thing by throwing everything into chaos, by putting, as I said, Theseus ahead of Jason and Medea, by making Achilles a baby when the Argonauts set sail, yet there's no reference to the judgment of the goddesses. There's no Troy as a site, given that the narrator is very into tourism and pointing out all the important sites in the Black Sea that people, or in the Hellespont, that people should be interested in. There's no reference to Troy at all. Which is, and then Valerius Flaccus picks it up later by saying, oh, and this is the first time the Argo arrived. But yeah, because in Apollonius, he's not mentioned. They don't stop at Troy. So yeah, there's definitely an attempt to sort of fool around with that. I don't think you can use Apollonius to get at the truth about when the fall of Troy was, because I don't think he is as interested in the truth as he is in the arguments about the truth. Like he's engaged in what I call controversy poetics, like stirring up controversy or playing with controversies, and not providing answers, as it were, or providing unsatisfactory answers. So that would be what I would say.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you for that wonderful talk. For those of you who
Thank you for coming.
Jackie, her emails often end with an apology for possible typos, or as she puts it in her own typo, hippos. So I felt that I should greet some hippos. So I have some hippos here, Jackie, to greet you. I have a ceramic hippo, I have a glass hippo, and last but not least, I have a cloth hippo who has listened with great interest to your presentation. So I thank you, and all the hippos thank you. And I think that I should hand this over to David just to say good night for a moment. So Jackie, thank you so very much. I look forward to being in the same room with you at some point, not so terribly long from now, I hope. And have a nice evening. And let me just hand this over to David for 1 second to say good night. David?
Thank you. And you have a good
Oh,
night
and
too.
here he is. Here
Hi,
he is.
everyone. Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, Jenny, for moderating the Q&A, and to all the attendees. Good night, and we'll give Jackie a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Good night, Jackie. Thanks so very much for taking the time.
Thank you.